Extending free school meals over the half-term and Christmas holiday would have cost the government £60 million. For some perspective, that's 1/200th of the money this country has spent on our failed test and trace system, or just 4 days of running the Eat Out to Help Out scheme. So why have the government expended so much political capital on denying kids in this country lunches in this half-term break? I expect we'll see a U-turn by Christmas. That's what we're going to be talking about tonight. I'm joined by Dalia Gebrial. How are you doing, Dalia?
I'm doing well. How are you, Michael?
Very well. I've got to say thank you for standing in. Dalia has stood in at the last minute today. Normally she's on a Friday. That's because Ash, as you'll know if you watched the show last week, has coronavirus. And I'm told, there's nothing serious, but she was feeling a bit more feverish than she was before. So, send your positive energies over to Ash in North London. How are you doing though, Dalia?
Yeah, I'm doing well. Sort of exhausted by the buffoonery that we are witnessing in the British government today. But other than that, that's kind of a normal day today.
Yeah, you're used to that.
So, yeah, for sure.
On the free school meals topic, we'll also speak to leader of Islington Council, Richard Watts. He's going to speak on why Johnson's excuses are bullshit. He didn't use that word. I've sort of ad-libbed. And why free school meals shouldn't be means tested. Very interesting interview, because not only is he leader of a London council, but he's also a campaigner with a group, Free School Meals for All. Me and Dalia will then discuss the latest evidence that Starmer doesn't necessarily care that much about international human rights. I then speak to Chilean politician Giorgio Jackson on a referendum that overturned a constitution from the Pinochet era. Big victory for progressives there, even though 78% it won by, so it's got support across the broad spectrum of Chilean society. And finally, we're going to discuss why covid-deniers are nearly always right-wing, sort of something that we just accept as if that's common sense. But why? What is it about right-wing ideology that means that if you think that COVID isn't a real thing, you're a right-winger? What's it got to do with low taxes and high borders? That's the puzzle we're going to try and unlock. As ever, tweet on the hashtag Tysky your comments and share the show link. Our first story. The row over free school meals has continued over the weekend, and given Parliament is in recess, it's dominated the news cycle today. It's always a bad time to start a new row that makes you look very bad in front of the public when there's nothing else going on. That's what the government have done here. Pressure on the government to reverse their policy is growing. It's coming from all directions, including Tory backbenchers. Though most significantly, in my view, was the Children's Commissioner who yesterday told Sophie Ridge on Sunday on Sky that the government's approach to poverty was almost Dickensian. She compared it to Oliver Twist. And very significantly, the 2,000 paediatricians who wrote to The Guardian calling on the government to shift policy. And we can go to that open letter. And this is from people who know paediatricians, children's doctors. If you are unsure, there have been paediatricians that have got their houses sort of graffitied because people didn't know they thought they were the other kind of pedo. So these are children's doctors. Let's go to the letter. So they write, "It is not unusual for us to care for children who don't have enough to eat or who don't have access to a substantial meal outside of what is provided in school. Good nutrition is at the heart of health, well-being and development for children and young people. Without it, children's health outcomes worsen, and with that, so do their life chances." So the letter goes on. More than 4 million children in the UK live in poverty, and around 1/3 of those are reliant on free school meals. The pandemic has entrenched and exacerbated this reality. Families who were previously managing are now struggling to make ends meet because of the impact of COVID-19. It is not good enough to send them into the holiday period hoping for the best, while knowing that many will simply go hungry. And then they go on. Food vouchers will not solve this problem, but they offer a short-term remedy. We call on the UK government to match the pledges of the Welsh and Scottish governments and the Northern Ireland Executive to continue to provide children from low-income backgrounds with free school meals over the coming weeks, and to then extend this at least until the Easter school holiday, as they have done in Wales and Scotland. Incredibly common sense demands from people who are very well qualified to speak on this. He's a children's doctor who say we often see people who come to us malnourished, right? So maybe just give them the fucking free school meal voucher. I don't swear that much on this show, but this is a stupid policy. This morning, the Health Secretary was sent out to justify this clusterfuck and the continued refusal of the Tories to shift policy.
what I'd say is that we've put in a huge amount of extra investment to support people during this coronavirus pandemic. And we've put in an extra £20 a week into universal credit. And we've also put money directly into supporting people in these circumstances. I think what I'd say is that I agree very strongly with the purpose of the campaign run by Marcus Rashford. I think we're all inspired by the way that he's led that campaign. And the purpose is that no child should go hungry, and that's right. The question is how we then fulfil that. And so I think that there is there's a need during this pandemic and at all times for the country to come together and to support people. And that's what we're doing, putting that investment in.
Matt Hancock's a terrible health secretary who makes terrible decisions, but I often do just pity him when I see him on television. It just seems like, I don't know, like he's killed your hamster and someone's grilling him about where it is. He looks so guilty and so like he just desperately wants to be somewhere else. Although I'm sure he loves the limelight. That's why he went into politics. I want to go to another clip of Hancock. Here he wades into a controversy about whether or not Boris Johnson had communication with Marcus Rashford.
There has been communication between the two, as far as I understand it, and and we've all seen what Marcus Rashford has done, and the way that he's conducted himself in this campaign that he's running, I think is absolutely exemplary. I mean, he's making an argument based on a personal experience for the benefit of people who really need that support, and as a result, there's support going in, not just from government, but from the community as well. And I just think that's, I pay tribute to him.
But we have it on good authority that there has been no response from the Prime Minister to Marcus Rashford's letter yet.
Well, I understand that there has been communication, but I'm obviously not in charge of the Prime Minister's correspondence. If there hasn't been, I'm sure that there will be, that will be followed up. And what we've got to do is work together to make sure that everybody gets the support that they need.
So in response to that first clip, I kind of felt sorry for Matt Hancock. Not really, because, I mean, he's a terrible health secretary, but he looked like he was in a difficult situation trying to make the best of it. That last clip you just watched, I found it so infuriating. It's so patronising. Oh, yes, well done, Marcus Rashford. What a lovely campaign he's done. Hasn't he dealt with it so well? Although, yes, of course I have the power to concede to his demand, and I'm not going to. I'm just going to stand here on national television and sort of pat him on his head. I mean, I found it kind of disgusting. Dalia, I want to get you in on that, actually. What do you think about those appearances by Matt Hancock this morning?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that they're fooling anyone, and I completely agree with you. It has that tone as if you're telling a child that, maybe they could be Prime Minister one day, that kind of just like really patronising, awful tone. And, there's not much that hasn't already been said about actually how depraved and cruel this fight is, and this idea of suspending free school meals at a time, in the middle of a pandemic, at a time when we don't have a sufficient furlough scheme. But, talking about kind of MP responses, what I find just like so kind of, sickening is this like, and we're going to go on to this later on in the show, is this idea of this like obsession and micromanagement with how regular people who are already struggling spend their tight budgets, and it's just so vulgar. And what really got me as well is in the House of Commons when this was sort of raised, the response being, well, we've put 20 quid extra into universal credit a week. And I'm just like, do any of you do your own grocery shopping? Like, when was the last time you went into a supermarket? That means fuck all. And it's actually pretty insulting to kind of like throw that back into the face of people who are struggling, that, we're going to give you an extra 20 quid in the middle of a pandemic, but we're not going to actually make sure that your kids are fed.
And with all of these people, it takes them like 5 minutes to spend 20 quid, right?
Oh,
like,
I have more.
20 quid is just like small change to them. It's not their weekly shopping has no relationship to 20 quid whatsoever. And they're just like, oh, poor people, they can do that. They can eat porridge. But we are going to get into a bit more detail about this, sort of like the sort of the horrific attitudes that this whole row has put on show among some people in this country's right. We're going to go on to Boris Johnson sort of addressing that Rashford interview. First of all, we can get up a tweet from Marcus Rashford, who in response to that appearance by Matt Hancock said, unless he's referring to the call we had following the U-turn in June, because Matt Hancock was either mistaken or lying there. There had been no communication between Marcus Rashford. He has written a letter to Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson has not replied. I also just want him to say, he's making a point from experience. Matt Hancock sort of saying, I can see where he's coming from. It's this emotional campaign by Marcus Rashford, but we're the evidence-based government. Appalling, clearly not evidence-based. We'll go through all of this in a moment. Let's go and look at Boris Johnson trying to justify the government's stance today.
Well, I haven't spoken to Marcus since June, but as I say, I think that what he's doing is terrific, and we support the local councils, and indeed we fund the local councils and many of the organisations that are helping in this period. But we're also, as I said, uplifting universal credit by £1,000, and we think that is one of the best ways you can help families in this tough time. I totally understand the issue of holiday hunger. It is there. We have to deal with it. The debate is, how do you deal with it? And we're very proud of the support that we've given. I've said repeatedly throughout this crisis that the government will support families and businesses, jobs and livelihoods across the country. We're going to continue to do that. I just repeat my single point, my most important point. We don't want to see children going hungry this winter, this Christmas, certainly not as a result of any inattention by this government.
Normally, so that's what they call a pool clip. So it's when you get a politician who goes out and gives a sort of clip to all of the various TV channels. And they obviously have a talking point to put across, but they're not supposed to be so explicit. Oh, by the way, this is what I'm going to repeat because this is what I want you to take away from this. I don't want kids to starve at Christmas. Can you give me a pat on the back? Because, I'm not necessarily a psychopath. I'm just going to, again, like Matt Hancock, patronise Marcus Rashford whilst ignoring all of his demands. Now, the central claim there, beyond the tone, beyond him trying to say, look at me, I'm not the Grinch, I'm not Scrooge, is him saying that the reason the government don't have to give out free school meal vouchers, even though the pandemic isn't over, is that they've added 20 quid to universal credit. And also what you'll have heard loads of Tory politicians go out today saying is we've already given £63 million to local councils, to local authorities to deal with things like hunger. So, why are you asking us for more? Now, this claim is pretty shaky. It's on shaky ground. Earlier today, I spoke to Richard Watts, leader of Islington Council, who's also a campaigner with the organisation Free School Meals for All. And I started by asking him what he thinks of Boris Johnson going around saying, I can wash my hands of this because I've already given £63 million to local authorities.
I was astonished by this claim, and I've genuinely no idea why the government has chosen this hill to die on this whole tawdry saga that they've got themselves into. To be absolutely clear, on the claims that they've given councils the money, the 63 million that the Prime Minister is referring to was given to councils months ago, I think June, July time, and has been used ages ago on all of the emergency support that councils were providing to their residents over the summer. In Islington, we used it for food vouchers, top-up vouchers for people who are struggling for power, an entirety of a mechanism that kept people going through the summer. But the idea you can turn around months later and use that money to try and get yourself off the hook on their total failure to listen to Marcus Rashford, Labour and Tory councils all across the country, and pretty much anyone else, that they should have put their hands in their pocket this half term is astonishing.
So that £63 million, to be clear, it's not that councils spent it more quickly than what government were expecting. Councils have spent it at the same speed government were expecting. So according to the government's own projections, that grant which they gave in June of £63 million would have run out by September. So now, in late October, they're coming out and saying, this money which we already projected would be gone by now can be used to fund the free school meals we're refusing to cough up for. Completely bizarre. As Richard Watts said, it's odd they've come out with this particular justification when it's so obviously false. I want to talk now, though, about a separate demand in Rashford's petition. It's interesting. It's something that I missed because other than providing meals over the holidays, Rashford is demanding that free school meals be expanded generally, their provision, the eligibility of them be expanded. So we can go and have a look at his petition. At the time we did this screenshot, it was 906,000. It's probably gone up a little bit. We took it about half an hour ago. And he calls for the government to expand free school meals to all under 16s where a parent or guardian is in receipt of universal credit or equivalent benefit. Now, the significance of this had passed me by. I assumed that most kids on low incomes would get free school meals. To me, that seemed like the point of them. If you are a family that is in poverty, then the point of free school meals is to make sure you won't have food poverty, at least for that meal that you have in school. But that's not the case. So after Friday's show, I got an email from Carl Rogers, who is a Tysky Sour viewer and a primary school head teacher. And he pointed out that on Friday's show, when me and Ash were talking about this, and we said, problem here is, McDonald's will give away free food for the free school meal scheme, but actually their workers will have to be on it because they pay them such pitiful wages. It turns out that actually, if you're on an incredibly low wage, but you're working, you don't get free school meals. It's very restrictive. They're actually, in general, apart from sort of in exceptional circumstances, only available to people on out-of-work benefits. The working poor are excluded. Let's listen to Richard Watt again.
It's one of those little-known facts, actually. The number of people who can qualify for free school meals are far less than is commonly thought. So really the people who can get it at the moment are really families kind of on out-of-work benefits only. And there's a whole group of people on low wages, that kind of critical sector in our economy of people on in-work poverty that don't qualify at all. So the last count, although the numbers have probably gone up since, there were 700,000 children in the country under the poverty line who didn't qualify for a free school meal. I think that's wrong, and I think it's deeply invidious.
So, that's obviously wrong. Why I was surprised by this is because we know 72% of children who are in poverty, their parents are in work, or one of their parents is in work. So this idea that poverty is something that happens to people who are out of work, obviously this is sort of comes across in Tory ideology that if you're poor, it's because you're feckless, it's because you're lazy. No, most people who are unemployed aren't feckless and lazy. There are structural reasons why that happens. But most people in poverty, most kids in poverty, their parents are in work. And if their parents are in work, they're not able to get free school meals, even though they're in poverty. By the definition used by the government, it's very, very strange, absolute no-brainer that meals should be available for free for all children who live in poverty. I can't believe that's controversial. We could go further, though. Now, this is more controversial. I personally think it's, again, kind of a no-brainer, but it's obviously a bigger move politically. Could we drop means testing altogether and provide free meals to all school-aged children? They already do it in Finland, Sweden, and India, Estonia as well, I think. Should we bring that in England? Should we throw out the window means testing altogether? I'm going to go back to Richard Watts because his council has provided free school meals for all primary school children for the last decade. So they show that it can work, and that's what's led him to be a big campaigner on this issue. Let's take a look at Richard explaining why other councils and the government should follow suit.
The reason why an incoming Labour council introduced universal free school meals in 2010 in Islington, the reason we've stuck with it through 10 years of brutal Tory cuts since then, is because it's made such a massive difference to families in the borough. It really does make an enormous financial difference to families on low incomes. Paying for school meals costs families somewhere between 300 and 500 quid a year. So for families with a number of kids in school, taking that burden off them is massive. But it's also made a big difference to children's dietary health. Obesity for primary school kids is actually falling in Islington. It's not all to do with the universal free school meals, but it's definitely something to do with it. And the quality of the food that kids are eating, often for many families, is the only decent meal of the day, is really much better than it would be if those kids were having packed lunches instead. And head teachers who started off being quite sceptical about this and saying, well, why don't you spend the money on new teachers, say, instead, something more directly that would help them, have become massive converts because they see kids who aren't hungry learning better in the afternoon, not disrupting their classmates, and the quality of learning in classrooms improving as the school day goes on. In a way, it can fall off if kids are just hungry. So there's some really good practical arguments for doing this, let alone the fact it's an incentive to support people into work. It doesn't contribute to the poverty trap where as soon as you get a job, it's yet another bill to pay on top of so many others as well. But actually, for me, it's the thing about fundamental human decency, which in a really divided borough like Islington, with many people who are very, very rich and many people who are very poor, actually not that many in the middle, it's a place where all kids eating together, all kids eating the same thing, of having that kind of sense that all of our kids are being catered for and looked after, I think matters an awful lot to us. And it's an immensely popular policy in our borough, and it's had profound good consequences for the decade we've run it.
That was Richard Watts, leader of Islington Council, talking about what sounds like a great programme, which, I mean, I'm convinced it should be replicated everywhere. Dalia, I want to go to you with two questions. So one, were you like me unaware of quite how many children in poverty were not eligible for free school meals? And two, I mean, I think I'm going to know your answer, but I mean, what do you think about this idea that school meals should be, or free school meals should be universal, that we shouldn't do means testing for it?
Yeah, I think so. I was aware because I think that in particular, as the cuts have happened, and this is kind of connected to the second question that you raised, which is one of the things that the Tories are really good at doing is basically pitting disadvantaged groups against one another. So whether it's, working class people who are not employed for whatever reason, maybe they are taking full-time care of their children, maybe they are not able to find work, maybe they have a disability, for whatever reason, pitting them against people who are in work but are also still struggling. And I think what I really appreciated about that interview clip was that it really brought back this idea that it is okay to fight for universal things. It is okay to fight for universality. The Tories have this way of and it also happens in the migration debate as well. One thing that the hostile environment was doing was saying which kinds of migrants can access which kinds of basic services, and creating reams and reams of bureaucracy and hoops that you then need to jump through to get basic healthcare, basic nutrition, basic human rights. And that is all a big distraction, and it's all a big way of making people feel like they have to fight horizontally for scraps rather than demand what we can provide for everyone. But what I think is also just really gross is the kind of what we've been seeing on Twitter of MPs and different kind of commentators talking about, what kind of meals you can get for what kind of prices, and, posting pictures of soft boiled eggs and, butter and toast, and saying this meal only cost me 30p, as basically a way of saying that, if you're poor and you're struggling to feed your kids, you should just budget better. And I think it's really
you're jumping ahead of me slightly. Because I've got some of these tweets up. I've actually got the soft-boiled egg.
Oh my
so
God!
you're giving the game away. Before we bring up the
English
soft-boiled
MPs
egg,
don't know how to cook properly. Honestly, it's disgusting.
We've got 1,800 people watching. We need to get that to over 2,000 while we're still alive. I know we can. So much to talk about this evening. Keep your comments coming. I love them. The chat is very lively today. Right. We're going to go to... Oh, and we got a super chat. I've got the wrong screen open. Amazing. Sherilyn Lauren with 15 quid. Very generous. Thank you very much. Hi, Michael. Please shout out my boyfriend, Rob. He watches Tysky Sour religiously and talks about NM, Novara Media, to practically everyone he meets. Get well soon, Ash. Sherilyn, Rob, thank you so much for your super chat and for evangelizing about Novara Media everywhere you go. You are a good Tysky Sour viewer. I expect that of all 1,800 of you, that you go out this week and, what else is there to talk about at the moment other than Novara Media and Tysky Sour? Right, let's go to this wrong and on Twitter. Dominic Farrell. And he has, gone viral with his soft-boiled egg tweet that Dalia previewed there. I want to introduce you to him, though. So Dominic Farrell is a former major in the British Army. You've got there the Winston Churchill with the V sign. 22,000 followers, reasonable. Followed by Claire Fox, ennobled by... Is it ennobled or given a peerage by the government? Chloe Wesley works in number 10. And this is the tweet that went viral. So Dominic Farrell says, 2 boiled eggs equals 28p. though someone has informed me he buys them for 12p each. Slice of wholemeal bread, 3p. Butter, a penny or two. Method, boil the eggs for 2 minutes, toast the bread, apply butter, total cost 33p. Now, and obviously, as Dalia was saying, this is the idea where you say, how could there be food poverty when food is so cheap? Now, when you can buy eggs for 12p and you can buy a slice of bread for free, obviously you can't buy a slice of bread for 3p, by the way, because you have to buy the whole loaf and it might go mouldy by the end of the week. But that's a somewhat separate issue. I did look this up, though, because that does seem like a reasonable breakfast. But a 13-year-old, an active 13-year-old, needs 2,600 calories per day. I didn't know this, but I looked it up on Google. Not much of a calorie counter myself. 2 eggs is 155 calories. A slice of brown bread is 92 calories. So that 13-year-old would have to eat that meal 10 times a day to get the necessary calories. So it's very easy to point to one meal which is cheap and say, this is one cheap meal. But actually, to create a balanced diet, what if the kid wants to eat fish? Do poor people not deserve fish? Do poor people not deserve chicken? Should they only ever eat 15 boiled eggs a day and a loaf of bread? I don't know. That seems to be the suggestion that's being made there. Let's go into a bit more detail about this guy. 22,000 followers. Got some strong opinions, followed by some important, powerful people. So his justification for opposing free school meals, as well as his knowledge about how much it costs to boil an egg. He says, I could go on. It's not about money. We have to address other issues such as parental responsibility. Free meals is not the solution to the underlying problems. In my view, it just increases dependency on the state, which is a strategic aim of UK Labour. Tackle the core issues. Now, this is strange for a number of reasons. Like, one, if you're worried about sort of like the state having lots of power, you were in the military, you're a general. That's sort of where your standing on Twitter comes from. That's why all these Tories seem to follow you, retweet you, think you're representative of good moral Britain. But you have a lot of state power there. So if that's your worry, I think you were probably in the wrong industry. But more importantly than this, I think probably what he's getting at is he's talking about state dependency as saying people will get lazy if they get money for nothing. There is a problem with this as well. My colleague Aaron Bastani looked through some more tweets of this prominent right-winger on Twitter, and it turns out he gets money for nothing. Let's get this up. Ask my family who got off the boat from Ireland. No benefits, fed 9 kids. That's real poverty. Supermarket, I walk. I'm sort of doing this in a heard of the delivery who doesn't have a kitchen. All my UC tenants, Universal Credit tenants, have fabulous kitchens. It's about choices, and calculators are essential. Now, this guy's a landlord. Is there any other better definition of someone in this country right now who gets lots of money for doing nothing than a landlord? And I can tell you, landlords get a hell of a lot more money than anyone gets on Universal Credit. And I know this because I pay half my fucking income to a landlord who doesn't do anything. He had enough luck to get that mortgage. Now I work to pay off that mortgage. Landlords are so much more dependent on other people's work than anyone in this country who's on benefits. So this idea that you can have former army generals, British flag in the Twitter handle, representative of, and this is the dominant ideology of the right. I mean, you hear Tory politicians saying this. They say, we can't allow state dependency to get in here. We can't allow people to be able to sit on their asses and just collect income as it comes in. When do you ever hear them say anything about landlords? And it's exactly, I actually think the incentive, there are some disincentives there. If you let people just shed loads of money from sitting on their asses with sort of 10 houses over here while they're absorbing the income of people who actually work, then they probably aren't going to do anything socially productive. Dalia, I want to bring you in on this because I know you've got lots of thoughts about all of these moralisers on Twitter, in the Houses of Parliament, on talk radio, who think that because porridge and boiled eggs are cheap, it's impossible that anyone in this country could go hungry.
Yeah, this is rooted in, and you can see it dripping from that man's tweet. This is rooted in this ideology that if you push working class people to the brink of survival, then they will finally figure out how to pull themselves up by the bootstraps. It's basically like the policy version of Paris Hilton's Stop Being Poor t-shirt. And what I find so interesting about this is, and you point out the hypocrisy with the landlordism, But again, this complete obsession with how everyday people spend their already tight budgets, which have been made even tighter by the fact that the pandemic has gutted people's ability to work, and the social state has been gutted over several decades. But these are the same government, the same people, the same MPs, and the same government that seems to piss money up a wall in a way that in a way that they are completely not accountable for, and with very little transparency. So one of the kind of big Tory MPs that have really emerged in this as sort of the primary bully of, hungry kids is Ben Bradley, who expensed 50 grand in expenses in just 1 year on top of his 70k salary. So we're not supposed to hold that to account or to scrutinise at every single penny that is spent by him over that year, but he is supposed to be scrutinising the minuscule budgets that people who are already struggling have. And not to mention actually this own government, where since the beginning of this pandemic, there have been £11 billion worth of contracts given to private contractors. £3 billion of that are actually unaccounted for, as in we don't actually know where that money has gone. And that's not to mention the several million, hundreds of millions that have been given to Tory friends, Tory donors, in order for contracts that they clearly weren't up to, whether that's, contracts for companies that ended up giving faulty PPE to NHS workers, or whether it's spending millions and millions of pounds on antibodies tests that the government didn't even bother to check that it was working. That's all public money. That's vast sums of public money being pissed up a wall that the government is spending without accountability, and yet they're getting on the neck of working class people who are in the middle of a pandemic, who are often doing work that is underrated, that is, whether it's care work or cleaning work, all of these kinds of work that are essential to our society functioning, but through no fault of their own is not valued enough for them to be able to be compensated enough to ensure that their children are healthy and are well sustained and are well looked after. So this idea of this scrutiny of people's budgets, I believe that every fucking cleaner, every care worker deserves a lobster dinner every single day, and I'm going to settle for nothing less. So the idea that we are having this conversation is absolutely indicative of that Tory ideology of pushing people to the brink, pushing people to the edge of their survival in order to somehow moralise them out of poverty. And Marcus Rashford has done a really good job of exposing that.
Categorize that really well, which is this idea. I mean, it's never expressed, but it's so apparent in how Tories speak, how the right-wing newspapers speak, indeed how New Labour ended up speaking, because they were so driven by the demands, by the pressures of the right-wing press in this country, is to say that only really poor people have to be scrutinised by the state. It's only poor people who have to answer questions about how they spend their money, because they're spending public money. But that doesn't work, because who else is spending public money? Serco are spending public money. Robert Jenrick is throwing away public money when he gives huge tax breaks to people because they sat next to him at a fundraising dinner. Or they say, oh, well, you get to, it's not about public money, it's about whether or not you work. It's about whether or not you work for an income. If you don't work for an income, then we're going to scrutinise what you spend your money on. So for one, we've already said, most people who are in poverty in this country do work. But also, if what you care about is people who are spending money that they didn't work to earn, look at the landlord class in this country. They are earning so much more money in total than people on benefits in this country. It's appalling. I just want to get up one last chart in this section, and because what you're going to hear from duplicitous Tories over the next few days is them saying, look, yeah, of course, we all agree with the objective. We all think that kids should be able to eat, but we don't think that vouchers are quite the way to do it. We're going to do it by the benefit system. We're going to do it by giving people jobs, etc., etc. Now, let's look at how poverty has changed under the Tories since 2010. So by every metric. Now, we can look at, can we get this up? So the one that's most dramatic here, single parents with children. You can see there from 2010 to 2018, that just rockets up. So the idea that, oh no, we shouldn't, the correct way to make sure that kids don't go hungry is through the benefit system, it's to put cash in people's pockets. Look, under your party, over the last decade, single parents with children, poverty has rocketed. It's gone from 20% to over 30%, right? So don't tell me, oh no, we won't give them free school meal vouchers, because actually the fix for poverty is something different. It's something that the Conservatives only sort of can see. No, the proof is in the pudding. Poverty has gone up with the Tories in power. That's because this ideology is a nonsense. They've pushed people into work. They said, oh, the route out of poverty is work. Work doesn't pay enough for so many people in this country to get you out of poverty. It's disgusting. We're going to end this section there. You know the score. I want you to subscribe to the channel. We need to get to £100,000. Not £100,000, that's like a Freudian slip. I'd love £100,000 for Novara Media. The things we would do with that, but for now we will settle for 100,000 subscribers on YouTube. I'm going to go to some super chats. Peter de Souza with a £5. Very kind. Can we just take a moment to remember that a couple of months ago we were bailing out millions and billions of pounds carbon emitting companies, but we can't feed the kids? Very important point. There are loads of companies who we bailed out without any conditions, airlines. S. Savia with a £5. We are many, they are few. It's true, but somehow they managed to win the election. So there is still a puzzle to be solved, even though I think you've got the fundamentals right there. Alex Cameron with a £5. Dalia's on fire. Yes. Dalia's head should pop up, I think, when that comes up. You can see, you know, her face receiving that. Yeah, that was what I wanted. Shanaz Hoke with a £5. This year I've shown the light of Novara to friends not interested in news and my parents after being converted myself. Thanks for what you do. Oh, I love reading that. That is so amazing. Don't think only my political friends will enjoy Tysky Sour. Show it to everyone. No excuses. And you know what, I'm going to go... Oh, no, I'll go through all them all. Taranet Amadi Parker with a 20 quid. Thank you very much. EO419... Just spreading awareness of the anti-abortion ban strikes across Poland. Get well soon, Ash. I'll make a note of that because I should educate myself, probably. And Rusty Sleeves with 2 quid. Big up to Comrade Dell, who started a job today. Big up, Comrade Dell. I hope your job goes well. I hope you're paid more than a poverty wage, like far too many people in this country. Far too many people in this country are paid a poverty wage. Right, next story. In a further sign that the Labour Party is becoming a hostile environment for advocates of Palestinian liberation, the Jewish Chronicle has reported that frontbencher Stephen Kinnock got a dressing down for a speech he made in September calling for action to stop illegal settlements in Palestine. Now, sources told the JC that Sir Keir Starmer was infuriated with the tone of Stephen Kinnock's speech. And we're going to discuss this story, but first of all, let's take a look at the speech in question and see if you can spot what made Sir Keir Starmer quite so angry.
It is essential that the UK condemns any further creeping annexation, but condemnation alone will never be enough. To this end, the UK government must take the following steps with urgency. First, it must immediately recognise the state of Palestine on the basis of the 1967 lines. The UK government argues that recognition should follow successful negotiations, but the logic of this argument is deeply flawed and partisan. It suggests that we are happy to see a 53-year-old occupation persist, legitimising the illegal actions of the Israeli government and contributing to the brutality and violence that shames us all. Second, the government must ban all products that originate from Israeli settlements in the occupied territories. Profiting from these products is tantamount to profiting from the proceeds of crime, and it must stop. When we trade with these settlements, we are essentially telling the world that international law does not matter, and such trade legitimizes and facilitates the existence and expansion of the settlements. In 2014, it was right that the UK, as part of the European Union, prohibited trade with Crimea, following its illegal annexation by Russia. It is crucial that we are consistent in our application of international law. Third, the government must act to end the involvement of UK-based companies within the illegal settlements. In March, the UN published a list of companies that are involved in the settlements, which included JCB, Opodo and Greencoat. Charities actively involved in illegal settlement projects should not be eligible for the privileges of charitable status, including tax exemption.
That was a really good speech by Stephen Kinnock, talking there about how you can't have any sort of peace which is on the foundation of illegal settlements. This is stolen land, which people are making money from. We should be banning imports from settlements, wherever they are, wherever you've got wherever you've got a power illegally occupying foreign land and sort of producing it on. So you obviously shouldn't buy from there. We don't do that with Crimea. Why would we do that with occupied Palestine? Anyway, let's see if you guessed what pissed off Sir Keir Starmer, and we can go back to that JC article. Labour's Stephen Kinnock has been reprimanded for using a House of Commons debate about the situation in the West Bank to accuse Israel of behaviour tantamount to profiting from the proceeds of crime. Lisa Nandy, the party's shadow foreign secretary, confirmed at a meeting with Jewish communal organisations last weekend that Mr Kinnock had been given a dressing down over a speech made on September 24th. Sources say Sir Keir Starmer was infuriated with the tone of the MP's speech. So what they're pissed off at is him saying that the situation in the West Bank is tantamount to profiting from the proceeds of crime. That's precisely what the situation in the West Bank is. And that's not controversial. That's not me saying, oh no, that you're the Labour Party, you should be passionate. It doesn't matter, if you are, loose with your language and overly passionate because, this is such an important issue. This is just simple fact. It's a simple statement of fact that the occupation of the West Bank by Israel, and this is recognised, but this is not to say, Israel's a settler colonial nation, so we have to have a one-state solution. That's a legitimate opinion. This is not that. This is sort of milquetoast liberalism, which is to say that Israel and Palestine, two separate countries, if you've got one of those countries which is moving outside of its borders, occupying land of the other country, building fences around it, stopping people of Palestinian ethnicity moving within it with guns, knocking down their houses, then growing olives on it or whatever and selling them to Europe, then clearly they are profiting from the proceeds of crime. It's against international law for good reason to occupy a foreign land and use guns to stop people from that land getting in there. It's so basic. And this guy was the head of the CPS, the head of the Crown Prosecution Service. And he's like, I can't believe he would say that Israel is profiting from the proceeds of crime by exporting goods from occupied West Bank. It's bizarre. Appalling, and if true, and they say in the article that Labour haven't denied it, so it seems like it is true. It is, morally abject, cowardly from Keir Starmer. But there's also, there were some elements of the article itself which I found very worrying, which sort of put on show quite how ridiculous this debate has become. So this is from the Jewish Chronicle article. The incident is embarrassing for Sir Keir on the eve of the publication of a report by the Equality and Human Rights Commission, which is expected to be damning on the question of how the party under predecessor Jeremy Corbyn handled anti-Semitism. Now, let's look at what Stephen Kinnock said. So Stephen Kinnock said that by exporting goods produced on occupied territories, Israelis are benefiting from the proceeds of crime. Now, one, I find it difficult for you to find an international relations scholar who doesn't think that's absolutely correct. But even if you were to say, oh no, Israel is all of the lands of, I can't remember what phrase they use, but if you say there isn't actually a Palestine, Israel is all of these lands. If you take the sort of wild geopolitical position that actually it's fine to occupy a foreign land and then export goods from that, if that's your weird sort of interpretation of international law, even then, that has nothing whatsoever to do with anti-Semitism. How can what Stephen Kinnock said have any bearing on the question of racism? It's just a simple statement of fact about international relations. And the fact that, a newspaper which is widely read and more than widely read, it's sort of widely credited. It's widely seen as, a legitimate voice saying something so ridiculous. I just find it unbelievable. We're just going to read a little bit more from that article and then I'll go to you, Dalia, for your thoughts on this. So let's get up, because the article talks about a call between Lisa Nandy, the Board of Deputies and the Jewish Leadership Council, which is where the comments about this dressing down of Stephen Kinnock first appeared. This was much more recent than his speech, which is why this story came out yesterday. Let's get this up. Sources claim that at the meeting, Miss Nandy, Mr Kinnock's immediate boss, confirmed to the Jewish leaders that he had been giving a dressing down for his tone in a Commons debate on September 24th. They said Miss Nandy confirmed there was anger at the very top of the party over Mr Kinnock's choice of words and his suggestion that Labour had hardened its policy towards Israel and the settlements. One told the Mail on Sunday, Lisa made no secret of the fact that she and the leader were angry with Kinnock, especially after all the work that has been done to try to restore Labour's relationship with the Jewish community. Now, Dalia, I'm just going to go to you on this. I mean, this idea that you should apologise for hardening your stance on settlements. I mean, you've got we as the Labour Party should soften our stance on settlements because otherwise we might offend someone. This is just, it's appalling, isn't it?
Yes, and this in many ways was the concerns that were raised over things like the IHRA, and it was raised by many anti-racist groups at the time, which was that its terms essentially made it really impossible for Palestinians to advocate for their rights as is outlined in the UN. You know, as you've sort of said, this is not some kind of fringe argument. This is a mainstream international legal argument. And it also creates these very dangerous collapses between what is a political issue surrounding, self-determination with a kind of politics of personal identity. And it creates a condition in which it becomes normalized to kind of conflate criticisms of the Israeli state and its actions towards Palestine with anti-Semitism. And that leads us into a territory that not only silences Palestinians, but it is itself anti-Semitic because it sticks the actions of a state to everyday members of a community who are just kind of trying to live their lives. And, something has clearly gone very wrong when a Labour MP is being reprimanded for repeating the position of mainstream organizations such as the UN, Amnesty International, etc. So, and as you've rightly pointed out, following legal precedent outlined by the EU's position on Crimea. So clearly something has gone very wrong. It's a severe attack on freedom of speech and freedom of expression. And it's really worrying and really sad.
Since some people sort of say, what Stephen Kinnock said, how is it different from Labour Party policy? There's a suggestion there that in what he said, he hardened Labour's policy towards settlements. And it is true that Lisa Nandy and the Labour front bench came up with a reasonable policy when it looked like Israel were going to legally annex the occupied territories. The Labour Party announced that if that happened, they would call for the government to boycott goods being exported from the settlements, or to ban goods being exported from the settlements. Stephen Kinnock went beyond that and said, basically we should ban imports from illegal settlements, annexation or no annexation. And this is what, has caused great anger at the top of the party. But again, this is completely ridiculous. So Stephen Kinnock there, in that speech, and the longer speech is worth watching as well. I mean, the point he's making is that what's the difference to a Palestinian de facto annexation or de jure annexation? So de jure annexation is confirmed in rules. De facto, it's confirmed in reality. If you have got people who are occupying some land, who are guarding it with guns, who will shoot people who get in there and who have stolen your land and are using it to create goods which they then export, who cares if that's legally called part of Israel or if it's legally called part of occupied Palestine? It's exactly the same. And it is exactly, this is important, it's the same breach of international law. Both of those things are against international law. Both annexing a contiguous territory is against international law and occupying it and de facto annexing it. It's all the same. And this idea that, oh no, we're very happy to import goods from your illegal settlement so long as you don't make it official, I just find, again, morally pathetic. I just want to go very quickly through another bit of news, which is very much related and shows how warped this debate has become. You mentioned there the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. This was what Jeremy Corbyn was under enormous pressure to introduce when he said, I've got some concerns that some of the clauses that were part of the example, so to say it's anti-Semitic to say that Israel is a racist endeavour, it's anti-Semitic to sort of treat Israel differently to other countries, all of these very vague things that anti-racists argued would be used to infringe on Palestinian rights. We've basically had some confirmation that this is happening, and it's happening in the Trump administration. Let's go to an article in Politico. So they report that the Trump administration is planning to use the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, to declare groups like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch to be anti-Semitic. According to the report in Politico, this would have far-reaching implications on their international reputations and ability to interact with the US government. We can get up a quote from this piece. The move is coming out of the office of Ilan Kar, the special envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism. A report from his office reportedly criticises these groups, which include Amnesty International and Oxfam, for their perceived involvement in the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement, a campaign to put economic pressure on Israel to end its West Bank settlements and change its policies towards Palestinians. Certain non-governmental organisations, NGOs, regularly participate in and promote the global BDS campaign or engage in other activities that meet the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism, reads a memo produced by Carr's office, which Mother Jones obtained. That urges Secretary of State Mike Pompeo to permit the release of its report. Through their participation in the global BDS campaign, these organisations have advocated in favour of harming US economic relations with Israel and US foreign policy interests. Now, this is exactly what people complained about when IRA was going to be, when it was, pressured, when the Labour Party was pressured to implement it, including all of those examples, was to say this is exactly the kind of thing which can be used to conflate issues pertaining to international relations, the boycott, divest and sanctions movement. That's about boycotting a country because it's illegally occupying its neighbour, with racism. It's a completely fabricated conflation, and it is now being used, surprise, surprise, by incredibly right-wing governments to have their way, to, as this says, to protect their economic relations and US foreign policy interests. They're using a definition of anti-Semitism, which the leading centre-left party in Britain adopted. And anyone who argued it shouldn't be adopted would say, why are you not adopting this internationally accepted definition of anti-Semitism? Blah, blah, blah. When did you see a British journalist take seriously the complaints of Jeremy Corbyn? No, they never thought, oh no, actually that's probably quite reasonable. They're like, no, he's clearly just an anti-Semite. Now Donald Trump is using this to the exact ends that Corbyn warned about, and I imagine we're going to hear silence. It's pretty disappointing. I mean, people will say, oh look, well, he hasn't done it yet. Maybe some courts will come along and say, oh no, that doesn't comply with IRA, so we're not going to be able to call Amnesty International an anti-Semitic organisation. What I'd say to that is the extent to which the Labour front bench are having to protest. Oh, no, we don't back BDS. We don't back BDS. We don't even back banning goods from occupied settlements unless there's official annexation. Oh, no. How worried, how quick they are to apologise, I think suggests that silencing effect on BDS, that McCarthyite sort of isolation of the BDS movement as something that one should apologise for even being, tangentially related to, I think that chilling effect has already come into force. I mean, evidently. We're going to go on to our next story. First of all, already, Novara Media, Tysky Sour, only possible because of your kind donations. If you are already a subscriber, if you already donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month, we are so grateful for you. You make this possible. But we do want to expand, and we want to get the technical situation, an even higher level, potentially go nightly. I mean, there's loads of plans in the woodwork, but we need to build our capacity to do that. A couple of super chats. Ben with a tenner. I appreciate your work. Kiss straight back at you, Ben. I appreciate your comment and your tenner. Username with a $5. And Nina Moore with a $5. Love from Berlin. We're going to have a referendum on remunicipalisation of the biggest real estate companies next year. Well, that sounds very interesting. Feel free to, at me on Twitter with information about that. I'm always, keen to get sight on new stories, especially if they're not being covered in the mainstream press here. Next story. After the election of the mass party in Bolivia, the good news keeps rolling in from South America. So on Sunday, Chile held a referendum to overturn the Pinochet-era constitution, which, and I didn't know this, it mandates that the private sector should control health, education, housing and pensions in the constitution. Now, I mean, these are clearly issues of government policy, not constitutional questions, but the constitution implemented under right-wing dictator Pinochet sort of tried to move this beyond politics, to say that, no, these public services have to be in private hands, incredibly reactionary. The referendum sort of happened as a result of pressure from popular movements. So last year you saw massive social movements, massive demonstrations in Chile. And one effect of that was that the right-wing president of the country had to concede that this referendum would take place. Now, the result was absolutely resounding. So 78% of Chileans voted in favour of drawing up a new constitution. There was also a second question, how should the constitution be written up? In that one, 79% of people voted that it should be written up by a directly elected body. The other proposal was that 50% of the people who were in charge of writing the new constitution would be people from the Chilean Congress. So people said, no, let's do it directly, let's elect this directly, let's make a new constitution. Huge mandate, huge mandate. And we can take a look at some scenes from the Chilean capital to kind of get a sense of what this means to people. Fireworks there, cheering. I mean, what's happening there is incredible. Looks very interesting. But you can see why this is so emotional, because Pinochet fell 30 years ago, but his policies, the neoliberal policies which were enforced with violence, horrific violence back in the 70s and 80s, are still, they have a shadow over the next 30 years. Whatever government you elect, health, education, housing and pensions are still going to have to be in private control. So for that to be overturned is a real political achievement, and you can see how much it means to people. To find out more about the political significance of this, what it all means, I spoke earlier to Giorgio Jackson. We were very lucky to speak to Giorgio. He's a deputy of the Chilean Congress and the founder of the political party Democratic Revolution. He is one of the most popular elected politicians in Chile, and he sits on the Council of the Progressive International. So I started by asking Giorgio whether the consequences of this result will be primarily symbolic or practical.
I think it's going to have huge impacts, because the current constitution doesn't allow many changes that the social movements have been protesting, 10, 15 years ago. So basically, the current constitution, it's like a barrier for all the changes that we are trying to push through social organizations, or also through politics. So this is the beginning for a new process. Of course, with a new constitution, it's not that from the night until the next day everything is going to be fine. No, it's a process. But we're leaving behind the Pinochet heritage of his constitution. And I think that is a great step, not only symbolical, but also in how can we distribute the power among the regions, and also through the citizens into the politics. And I would say it's going to have huge impact on the real politics.
This constitution, which seems, it seems to be very imposing on Chilean politics. It's saying that health has to be in private hands. I mean, how did it manage to survive so long? It's been a long time since Pinochet fell.
Yeah, 30 years. And one of the demands, because I don't know if you knew, but the protest last year began with a rise of the ticket for the subway, for the metro, and was 30 pesos, 30 Chilean pesos. That's like very little amount if you will think about a budget. But for the familiar budget, it was like like one drop that make all the glass. I don't know how to say it, but the straw becomes back.
The camel's back.
Yeah, that's how you say in English. And I would say that, and the popular say was, it's not about 30 pesos, it's about 30 years, And the last 30 years, of course, the conservatives allow a number of reforms, but they never took the basics, the fundamentals of the constitution. And I would say that is one way how the anger was slowly cooked into this explosion that was last year, and the inequalities that we lived seem to not concern a lot to the elites in our country. And I would say that today, yesterday, the results shows that we have 345 local districts, municipalities, and only 4 of them voted for the rechazo, that was the no to the referendum, And all the the rest voted in great majority to the approval. So I would say that the elites, these 3 or 4 municipalities that has the highest income in our country are the only ones who see a country different, and that's a clear sign, I guess, for and a clear message for all the people who is now in the economical power and also the media, the mediatic power, and also the political power for a change. And I think that they are the great losers in this referendum, because they try to make fear campaigns. They try to scare people through the last year. And the people of Chile didn't react to that. But I don't know, we are very excited, very emotional about this process, and very happy for and with hope for the future.
That was Giorgio Jackson, a Chilean congressperson, sits on the Council of the Progressive International and founder of the Democratic Revolution Party. I thought it was really interesting there that every district in the country had voted yes to this, apart from the 4 richest districts. And I mean, that tells you everything you need to know about it, right? Because the reason why you have this shadow of Pinochet after Pinochet is because they're saying you can have democracy, but you can't have that much democracy. Some things are going to be out of bounds. It's going to be out of bounds that you have, actually the kind of policies that are completely normal in a social democracy. You have public control over housing, education, and health, pensions, kind of thing that's incredibly normal. These aren't radical policies. These should not be in a constitution. And it's also worth, remembering, most of our audience will know this, but Pinochet, his biggest backers, Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, right? So that dictatorship there was supported so strongly. He didn't have any stronger backers than the people who were supposed to be the leaders of the free world. It tells you so much. The fact that constitution outlived Pinochet tells you about Chilean politics up to this point. And when you look at sort of the motley crew of powerful Western leaders who supported that horrible, horrible dictator, tells you a lot about international politics. We're going to go to our final story. First of all, though, let's get a couple of super chats. We don't have those up at the moment. Fox will get some of those up. We'll do those after the next section. Oh, he's got one. Jeff Harple with 11 quid. Thank you very much. Let's go straight on to the next section, though. Oh, no, we had a question. Would love to see a panel of Aaron, Ash, Michael, and Umair Hack. Any chance of that happening? Well, first of all, I'm going to have to find out who Umair Hack is. I hope this is not one of those. It's always a danger admitting I'm ignorant of something on the show, because people will say, how can you possibly host a left-wing talk show and not know who this person is? But I will look them up and hopefully will not feel very embarrassed this evening. Let's go to our final story. What defines a right-winger? They want lower taxes, lower benefits. Usually, they want harsher border regimes, and nearly always they're very relaxed about racism. But is it time to add a new criteria to the ideology of the right? COVID-denialism. Let's take a look at the weekend at the world's most powerful politician of the right at a rally, and this will sort of, this is our first piece of evidence in the case as to why COVID denialism should be included in the definition of what it means to be a right-winger.
Some countries, they report differently. If somebody's sick with a heart problem and they die of COVID, they say they died of a heart problem. If somebody's terminally ill with cancer and they have COVID, we report them, and doctors get more money and hospitals get more money. Think of this incentive. So some countries do it differently. If somebody is very sick with a bad heart, they die of COVID, they don't get reported as COVID. So then you wonder, gee, I wonder why their cases are so low. This country and their reporting systems are really not doing it right. If somebody has a really bad heart and they're close to death, even if they're not, but they have a very bad heart and they get COVID, they put it down to COVID. Other countries put it down to a heart. So we have to be. We're going to start looking at things because they have things. They have things a little bit backwards.
It's obviously, I don't need to explain why that is so stupid. I mean, excess deaths in the United States, like in the UK, so these are deaths which happen over and above the deaths that would usually happen, far outstrip the official death toll for coronavirus. So this idea that coronavirus, the official death toll, is just sort of double counting people that would have died anyway. No, the excess death toll is much bigger than the official death toll. So he's got it all the wrong way around. But I don't really need to explain that to you. We're going to go to Britain. Because whilst, we all remember Boris Johnson bragging about shaking the hands of COVID patients in hospital, he is someone like Donald Trump who has a history of downplaying the severity of this particular virus, of this particular disease. But our leading politicians in this country, those they might be, incompetent, morally, appalling, outrageous, they aren't quite as divorced from reality as someone like Donald Trump. However, our Murdoch-controlled press do give Trump a good run for his money. Let's take a look at a debate last week between Labour MP Chris Bryant and talk radio host and Sun editor Dan Wootton.
Chris, you do understand that science has forever used herd immunity in order to deal with these these coronaviruses. I really believe you need to read
herd immunity.
Yeah, and protecting the vulnerable, and I really think you should read the Great Barrington.
The vulnerable? Just take me through how you protect the vulnerable.
There's a whole load of ways to do it, Chris. There's a whole load of ways to do it, and the Great Barrington Declaration spells it all out. But look,
you're a nutcase. You're a complete and utter nutcase, Chris, and you're dangerous as well.
Chris, do you know what? You can go off now. Get rid of this man, because actually, we will not have people abuse.
Well done, Chris Bryant. It's so telling. Dan Wootton has asked quite a basic question. How are you going? So in this theory, and the herd immunity people, so they're trying to downplay the severity of COVID, say we don't need these lockdowns. All we need to do is protect the elderly and basically let it run through society, let it loose, whilst protecting those who are most likely to die from it. And the problem with this, even though it might theoretically work, obviously long COVID and stuff makes it sort of somewhat a scary idea. But the problem is, no one has found a way of doing this. This was the UK government's original plan, was to sort of protect the elderly and let it run through the population. It turns out that if young people get a disease, you can't actually stop old people getting a disease. There's no way of doing this. It's not like the Barrington Declaration, which he's referring to, solves that problem. It begs the question, how are you going to do that? Dalia, I want to go to you. So we're going to move on to the far right in a moment and sort of outright COVID denialism. But the idea that you have to downplay coronavirus, which is common to both Donald Trump, Boris Johnson, and the likes of Dan Wootton and Julia Hartley-Brewer on the Murdoch-owned talk radio. What is it about the right that brings out this particular reaction? You don't see it on the centre left, you don't see it on the far left.
I mean, I honestly, the only thing that I can arrive at is this idea that the solution to climate change, the solution to coronavirus, or the way that, I mean, there is a connection in the right wing response to both of them, but even sort of like epidemiologists, scientists who are kind of not involved in the politics of it, or in kind of not in an explicit way, I think what the issue is that the actual solution to this pandemic revolves around a communal response. It revolves around this concept of solidarity, that we change our behaviors and we maybe sacrifice going out to the pub, whatever, in order to protect those who are more at risk of this virus than we might be. It requires that, it goes against everything that Margaret Thatcher sort of says of there is no such thing as society. It can only rely on society for us to actually implement the kind of measures that we need to, and to have the kind of will that we need to in order to get through this. And I just think that maybe at that base level, that rubs them up the wrong way. They find it uncomfortable. They find it gross. And that's why perhaps we are seeing this desire to kind of downplay it, because we know what we actually need to do in order to tackle this virus until at least we get, a vaccine. And that kind of what we need to do goes against the actual value system of individualism, of, so-called survival of the fittest type politics that a lot of these people live by.
I think that's a really important point. The solutions to this, the necessary implication of recognizing that coronavirus is a serious problem, is that we are going to need, state intervention and collective intervention. And we're going to need social trust. We're going to need all of those values and all of those ideas, which, I don't think are the property of the left, but which are espoused by the left. I think the other is just that they're not interested. They're only interested in a social problem if they get to shit on people who are either poorer than them or browner than them. If coronavirus was coming just from gay people or just from migrants, I think these people would be talking about it like it was the fucking end of the world. But because it seems to be, it doesn't really have you can't frame this as something that's only coming from a dangerous outsider. They're just not interested. They don't care. If 61,000 people had died in this country, that's the excess death toll, because of something which had been brought over by immigrants, you would never hear the end of it on talk radio. But because this is something which, hits society at its core, you can't really divide people very successfully to blame people. Obviously, Donald Trump tries. The only time he brings it up, and Dan Wootton was actually exactly the same, whenever he got a question in the Downing Street press conference, it was to ask a question about China. They're only interested to the extent you can blame brown people. Beyond that particular talking point, they don't care. If they could blame poor people, they would, but they can't. So they're just like, well, it's not that big a deal then. They're not interested. I want to go one step further to the right. So as I've said, mainstream politicians and journalists of the right usually just downplay COVID. They don't normally deny outright that it's a thing or just say that it's completely invented, that it's a pure conspiracy. You have to go further to the right for that. We'll discuss that in a moment. First of all, let's take a look at a BBC interview with the son of a leading COVID denier.
Sebastian is 21, into politics, travelling, and his mum, Kate Shemirani, has become notorious for spreading conspiracy theories during the pandemic.
What she's doing is dangerous.
You nurses dancing, I'm coming for you.
This is her 5 minutes of fame.
You will stand trial for genocide.
I don't want to be here talking about, but it's something I think we've got to do before these ideas get bigger and more people fall down the same route that she's trying to take them down. You can only prevent it before it happens.
His mum has become a headliner at anti-lockdown rallies.
You know that this is all a lie, this COVID-19.
And promoted baseless conspiracy theories about 5G, vaccines and the pandemic.
That's going to go into your DNA, it's going to change you forever, which means that you are no longer of the creator, they can put a patent on you, and you cannot be genocided.
Thousands of people are taking her to be this source of truth and this saint. And I wish I could tell them all, my mum is not the person that you think she is. She's someone with a massive amount of self-interest and loves being the centre of attention.
Sebastian's concerns are about public health. There is no evidence to back up claims his mum makes about 5G and coronavirus, which have been linked to real-world damage, and she encourages followers to ignore health guidance. He was also shocked to see far-right people in her crowds.
My dad's Iranian. All of her kids are mixed race. And she's out there getting all this clout and attention from people who don't think, I should exist, and definitely wouldn't like to listen to her if they did any digging whatsoever.
I mean, it's really sad for that son. It's a very interesting interview and piece from the BBC, to be fair to them. Dalia, I want to get you in for this again. So we've sort of covered why the centre-right aren't particularly interested in COVID or want to downplay it. The solutions don't really fit with their ideological persuasions. Also, it doesn't really serve any of the purposes that outrage often serves. And outrage is normally for them about either dividing the working class or hating an outside group to distract from their own corruption. But why is it that the far right think that coronavirus isn't a thing at all? Not all of them, but lots of them. It seems like there must be a different explanation for that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is being used by the far right to kind of stoke up mistrust of the mainstream scientific community and political elites on their terms, i.e., we're going to stoke up your already instinctive feelings of mistrust and ensure that it is stoked up in a very particular way that ties you to our project. And obviously in this context, it leads, and as it often does, leads to very deadly consequences. But I think that one thing we have to be aware of, and the reason that I had climate change on my mind is because this really reminded me, and I think that one thing that makes it really easy for the far right to use this as a hotbed for the growth of conspiracy theories, which then almost acts as a kind of gateway drug into their sort of framework of politics, is the fact that the messaging from the top is so confused. So, you have scientists and you have epidemiologists saying one thing, and then you have politicians taking measures that don't make any sense in relation to what's being said. So things like, you're not allowed to go see a family member indoors, but you are allowed to go and sit in an office and, breathe in other people's, share the same breath or whatever as loads of other people. And, so it just doesn't add up. And when it doesn't add up, when there's a fundamental lack of trust in it, the conditions for conspiracy theories grow. So I think rather than this being like a political position being taken by the far right, I actually think it's more of a strategic one. And the reason I think it's similar to climate change is because it reminds me of this person that I grew up around, who I was and I think still is a climate denier. And she always used to say to me that, if climate change was as real and as serious as they're saying it is, then the government could stop the fossil fuel industry tomorrow. But they don't, because, they have a profit incentive. But they only talk about climate change when they want to control what I eat, make me feel bad for driving my car or not recycling. So clearly, to her, she's like, well, this isn't actually as real or as scary as they're saying it is. They're just using it to control my life. Now, obviously, that leads to a really dangerous path, which is climate denialism. But it's not come out of nowhere. She's identified a kind of hypocrisy, a lack of structural political will to address a big crisis, but instead focusing on individual behaviors, which is an analysis that the climate movement itself has. But she obviously takes it into a completely whack, kind of direction. So I think that, whilst obviously it is, the far right are using this, they are exploiting this as I think more of a strategic gain, because there's no explicit ideological or political gains to be made. I think it is actually weirdly the mainstream kind of that neoliberal refusal to take the measures that are necessary to create this very confused messaging, to not take the structural action that is necessary if it's going to cut into that kind of political, economic, interests, that it creates the perfect conditions for the far right to come in with their own explanations of why something that doesn't make sense and something that doesn't add up is the way it is. But like you said, I think it's really difficult to understand why they are attaching onto this from a kind of theoretical position or from a kind of political position. I think it's more a strategic one, because conspiracy theories are really central as a gateway drug into the broader politics of the far right, and they've gotten very good at using it in order to get people hooked and to get people to trust them and their sources of information and their figureheads, because of the clear absence of trust in mainstream politics.
No, I mean, I think probably that's the majority of it, actually, which is that this is kind of a cynical utilization of a tool, which is a gateway drug, so that they can sort of hook people onto an ideology which is more directly of the far right. But I do also think, and this is something that I've sort of got from the writing of Vincent Bevins, he's been on the show before, spoken to myself and to Tower Ambrostani, which is sort of the sometimes crazed ideology of anti-communism, where you think that everything is this sort of conspiracy by people at the top. It's often anti-Semitic. You think that there's sort of a Jewish cabal who are trying to do this, but they're trying to get absolute control over society. And then you see things like climate change and COVID-19 as part of this conspiracy to get absolute control over society. And it is why I think why the right tend towards this is because it only makes sense if you think that there is this sort of what's the motive there? Because I mean, obviously, if you've got an understanding of the world as a left-wing person, you see that what people want is profit. It doesn't make sense for profit-seeking capitalists and states who want national security to invent climate change or to invent COVID-19. They're not, they're profiting from this sometimes because they're giving their money to their mates, but it's not particularly helpful for the workings of global capitalism for lockdowns to happen. So I think it's only if you're on the far right, where what you are against is control for control's sake, that you can come up with a sort of bizarre narrative to make COVID-19 all fit into, it's often a New World Order vibe, isn't it? So I do think there is something which is to do with the ideology of the far right, which means that they fall into this. And I think it has a lot in common with anti-communism, deluded, deranged anti-communism. But I also think, it's a very opportunistic way of, how do we get people who are completely detached from the establishment, who we can sort of bring into our own toxic political circle. Very interesting. We're going to end there. Dalia, Gebrial, always a pleasure to speak to you. How are you? Well, I was going to say, how are you doing? It's got to that point in the show where I'm sort of like, maybe we'll just start again. Welcome to Tysky Sour. I'm joined by Dalia, Gebrial. No, it's brilliant to have you on. We'll be back on Wednesday at 7 p.m. I should announce, actually, there's going to be we usually have an interview on Tuesday at 7 p.m. That won't happen this week because Ash has got coronavirus. That will be back next week. Again, send your all your positive energies to Ash Sarkar. For now, I'm going to do a couple other super chats. This one is so nice. Oh my God. Bulletproof blouse with a $5. It's been lovely to see over this last year those live viewers numbers climbing up. My first hour of work on a Monday, I think that was for Novara. That is so sweet. That idea. Yeah, you're giving us 1 hour's wage a month so we can continue working. Beautiful. I love it. Thank you so much. We've had about 2,000 of you joining us tonight. 750 likes. Let's get that to at least 1,000 while you're still here. And of course, if you're new to the show, do hit subscribe. For now, you've been watching Tysky Sour on Novara Media. Good night.